Maybe Nurse Walsh's decades-old Navy experience makes her think she knows better than a Harvard-trained surgeon. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 47 minutes before everything changed. Margaret Walsh moves through Cedar Creek Medical's ICU like a ghost, graying hair pulled tight into a bun so severe it stretched the skin at her temples, sensory details of bleach-scented floors and humming fluorescent lights washing over her unremarkable scrubs. 3 years of night shifts have made invisibility her superpower. She checks vitals with mechanical precision, her hand steady as surgical lasers despite the slight tremor that appears only when she touches the tarnished challenge coin in her left scrub pocket. A faint scar runs along her collarbone, visible when she leans forward over a patient chart, a thin white line that tells stories nobody asks about. She's monitoring patient records on the 4th floor, cross-referencing admission times against a mental list no one else knows exists. Her real mission. The reason Naval Intelligence placed her here 3 years ago. The reason her official file says registered nurse and her classified file says something else entirely. The ICU hums with its usual morning rhythm. Ventilators wheezed their mechanical heartbeat. Monitor lines traced green mountains across black screens. A blood pressure cuff inflated with a soft pneumatic hiss. Margaret stands at Station 4, updating the medication log for Bedford 12, when the elevator doors open at the far end of the corridor. Dr. Richard Caldwell sweeps in like he owns the building, because in his mind, he does. His white coat is pristine, expensive, tailored. His shoes are polished to a mirror shine. He trails for residents behind him, all of them gripping tablets and notepads, all of them afraid. He had no idea the woman he was about to humiliate had pulled 6 men from a burning convoy in Marja 20 years ago. He had no idea that her hands, which he was about to mock in front of his entire surgical team, had performed emergency field surgical procedures with nothing but a combat knife and a prayer. Grand rounds, one of the residents whispers to Margaret as they file past. She doesn't look up from her charting. She never looks up. Caldwell moves from bed to bed like a general inspecting troops. He corrects a resident's assessment of a post-operative pneumonia patient. He questions the antibiotic choice for a septic patient in bed 408. He moves with absolute authority, the kind of authority that comes from knowing nobody will challenge you. His voice carries the flat arrogance of a man who has never been wrong in his own mind. By the time he reaches Station 4, Margaret is still writing, her pen moving across the chart in steady, even strokes. Nurse Walsh, he says. The way he says her name makes it sound like an accusation. She looks up. Dr. Caldwell. I was wondering if we might discuss your assessment of the post-operative bleeding in Bedford 10. He gestures toward the residents. They gather closer, sensing blood. The patient's hemoglobin dropped 0.3 grams since yesterday. You documented losing. That's quite vague language for a Harvard-trained surgical team, don't you think? Margaret sets down her pen. The bleeding is controlled. Is it? Caldwell steps closer. His voice rises. Not angry yet. Performative. Because I'm curious how someone with your background feels qualified to assess controlled versus uncontrolled post-operative hemorrhage. Perhaps your decades-old Navy experience makes you think you know better than a Harvard-trained surgeon. The room goes quiet. The residents shift their weight. One of them, the youngest, maybe 26, looks at his shoes. Margaret doesn't flinch. She doesn't blink. She doesn't feel the heat rising in her chest or the way her jaw clenches. These are just data points, information processing. She catalogues Caldwell's escalation stage like she's reading a chart. Social attack. Public humiliation. Designed to establish dominance and set boundaries. She recognizes the pattern because she's studied it for 20 years. The patient's vitals are stable, Margaret says. Her voice comes out flat. Clinical. Removed. Hemoglobin dropping 0.3 grams over 24 hours is within normal post-operative range for a 4-hour abdominal procedure. The oozing has decreased from 2 milliliters per hour to 0.5. I documented what I observed. How fascinating. Caldwell turns to face the residents directly, effectively dismissing her decades-old experience. One might assume that would confer some wisdom. Instead, we get losing. One might also assume that someone with military background would understand chain of command. One might think she would defer to the surgeon who actually made the incision. Margaret returns to her charting. She doesn't respond. She doesn't defend herself. She doesn't argue or explain. Caldwell waits for a reaction, some crack in her composure, some evidence that his words have landed. When none comes, he frowns. The absence of reaction is its own kind of insubordination, and it irritates him more than any argument could. He moves on to the next patient, the next opportunity for dominance. But that wasn't the worst part. By afternoon, Margaret has moved through her rounds with the quiet competence that has kept her alive for 26 years. She checks for sights. She monitors fluid balances. She observes and catalogues and documents. At 3:45 p.m., she's reviewing the medication chart for bed 415, a 62-year-old woman recovering from a thyroid resection, when she notices something that makes her stop. She reads it twice to be certain. The morning medication order shows metoprolol 50 mg intravenously, documented as administered at 11:15 a.m. But the patient's heart rate is currently 132 beats per minute. Tachycardic. Elevated. For a patient who should be bradycardic on a beta blocker. Margaret checks the patient's history. No documented allergy to metoprolol. No contraindications. She pulls up the previous cardiac history. The patient is post-operative day 2 and shouldn't have an elevated heart rate like this. She looks at the medication order again. Metoprolol. 50 mg. 4, but the order was written in Dr. Caldwell's handwriting. And the dose is half of what the patient's preoperative baseline indicated she needed. Margaret moves without hesitation. She pulls the physical medication record. The pharmacy printout clearly states the dose should be 100 mg based on the patient's cardiac history and weight. Caldwell's order says 50. Someone made an error. Or Caldwell made an error. Either way, Margaret is now holding a discrepancy between what was ordered and what should have been ordered. She walks to the nurse's station and finds Caldwell reviewing charts. Around her, the ICU continues its work. Monitors beep their electronic pulse. A ventilator whooshes. Rubber gloves snap as a tech prepares for a dressing change. The fluorescent lights hum their endless fluorescent song. Margaret approaches him with the chart in her hand. Dr. Caldwell, I need to clarify something about the metoprolol order for bed 415. He doesn't look up. It's written in the chart. The dose is 50 mg, but based on her preoperative cardiac baseline and her current weight, the standard dose should be 100. The pharmacy protocol indicates. I'm aware of pharmacy protocol, Nurse Walsh. Now he does look up. His eyes are flat. Are you suggesting I made an error? I'm asking for clarification. The patient's heart rate is elevated. The patient's heart rate is elevated because she's post-operative and anxious. Not everything is a medical crisis. Some things are just nursing. He turns back to his chart. The order stands. Margaret doesn't move. She has 17 years of experience with doctors, and she can read the signs. This isn't a man reconsidering his order. This is a man digging in because his authority has been questioned. But the medication error is documented. The discrepancy is real. She has to say something because a patient's cardiac stability depends on correct dosing, and she cannot simply walk away from that. I'd like to document this conversation, she says quietly. For the patient's safety. Caldwell stands. His face reddens. The change is immediate, from cool dismissal to something hotter, something that indicates she has crossed a line he has drawn. His voice, when he speaks, is low and controlled but carries an edge that makes a passing resident step faster. You will do no such thing. You will take the order as written, or you will leave this hospital. I will have security escort you from this building. Do you understand me? You can either do your job or you can find another one. Those are your options. The room is listening now. The resident who was hurrying slows down. A tech pauses in the middle of charting. Margaret stands there with the medication record in her hand, and she understands exactly what just happened. Caldwell has moved from social attack to strategic escalation. He has threatened her job. He has made clear that questioning him will have consequences. It's stage 3 in the progression, and it's been deployed with precision. She closes the chart. I understand. Good. Caldwell sits back down. Now make yourself useful elsewhere. Margaret walks away. She doesn't go back to her station. She doesn't finish her medication review. She walks past the ICU desk, past the patients, past the residents who are trying very hard not to make eye contact. She walks to the supply closet on the 4th floor, the one by the stairwell that nobody uses, and she steps inside. The door closes with a soft pneumatic hiss. The supply closet is narrow and fluorescent lit and lined with boxes of gloves and gauze and saline bags. Margaret grips the edge of the metal shelf with both hands until her knuckles go white. She doesn't cry. She doesn't shake. She doesn't give voice to the rage that is moving through her chest like a second heartbeat. She simply grips the shelf and breathes, in for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4, a technique drilled into her muscle memory by 26 years of active duty and combat deployments and moments that required absolute composure. Then she reaches into her left scrub pocket and pulls out the tarnished challenge coin. It's small, about the size of a quarter, old silver worn smooth by decades of handling. On one side is engraved the emblem of SEAL Team 3. On the other side, barely visible now, worn almost into invisibility by years of touch, are 4 letters, WOLF. The call sign she hasn't used in 18 years. The identity she buried when she took the civilian nursing job. The woman she was supposed to stop being. She was 24 years old when she was deployed to Marja, Helmand Province, Afghanistan. 24 and assigned to a 6-man reconnaissance element hunting a Taliban leadership cell. 24 and the only woman on a team of operators who had not wanted her there. She had proven herself in 2 previous deployments, but the doubt followed her like a shadow. The question mark hung over every decision: can she handle this? Will she hesitate? On the 5th day of the operation, a building they were clearing became a death trap. The Taliban had wired it with explosives. The detonation came at 14:23 local time. 3 operators went down. One had a compound fracture of the femur. Another had shrapnel embedded in his shoulder and abdomen. The third, the youngest, barely 20 years old, had a fractured pelvis and severe lacerations. Margaret had been the team medic. She had moved into that building while her team laid down suppressive fire. She had performed emergency procedures using equipment that was never meant for that level of trauma. She had held 3 men together with her hands until the medevac helicopter could land. And one of those men, the youngest, the one with the fractured pelvis, had been 6 years old the first time she met him. His father was a local militia commander, aligned with the Afghan army. The boy had stepped on a roadside mine during a joint patrol. Margaret had been the first person to reach him. She had stopped his bleeding. She had administered morphine from her field medical kit. She had pressed this tarnished challenge coin into his small hand and told him, "This is a promise coin. It means I promise I'll find you again. I promise I'll make sure you're okay." She had meant it as a comfort for a dying child. She had not expected him to live. But he had lived. And 18 years later, she had ended up at Cedar Creek Medical in Portland because Naval Intelligence had flagged an anomaly. A former Marine with a Navy-connected background had been asking questions about SEAL team operations at a bar in Seattle. Questions about deployments. About current operations. About security protocols. Intelligence had placed Margaret in the hospital as a standard cover, quiet nurse, invisible, positioned to monitor if anyone with classified knowledge attempted to make contact or pass information. She had never expected the boy to show up in her ICU with 3 bullet wounds. She grips the challenge coin and remembers the weight of that 6-year-old in her arms. She remembers his eyes, fever-bright, terrified but trying to be brave. She remembers whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. She stares at the tarnished coin now and understands that Dr. Caldwell has just threatened the one thing she cannot afford to lose, her access to this hospital. Her position. Her ability to monitor. Her responsibility to the man this boy became. Margaret takes a breath. She places the coin back in her scrub pocket. She straightens her scrubs. She steps out of the supply closet and returns to the ICU, her face composed, her manner professional, her eyes carrying the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The night shift begins at 7 p.m. Margaret clocks in like she does every night. She moves through her rounds like a ghost, invisible and present, documenting vitals and monitoring medications. And she waits for what comes next. Because Caldwell has no idea who he just threatened. And more importantly, he has no idea who is about to walk through those hospital doors. The vending machine hummed its mechanical song as Margaret slid a dollar bill into the slot. She'd timed this break carefully, 3:42 p.m., between shift changes, when the corridor traffic thinned to almost nothing. The machine accepted her payment with a mechanical clunk, and she reached for the black coffee in the bottom row. That's when she heard the voices. Still playing soldier, Margaret. Dr. Patel's tone carried the false brightness of someone performing cruelty for an audience. He stood 3 feet away, Dr. Morrison flanking him like a support strut, both men positioned deliberately between Margaret and the exit. Maybe the VA clinic needs someone with your particular rigidity. Morrison smirked, arms crossed. This isn't a battlefield. We follow the chain of command here. His emphasis on chain of command dripped with condescension, as if explaining basic rules to a child. Margaret extracted her coffee. The cup was still warm, the steam rising like a small ghost between her and their faces. She could feel their eyes tracking her movements, waiting for a reaction, hoping for one. The fluorescent light above buzzed its endless industrial hum. She'd learned in Marja that silence was a weapon sharper than any blade. It made people uncomfortable. It made them angry. It made them predictable. The VA wouldn't want me either, she said quietly, turning to leave. Patel's laugh followed her down the hallway, too loud, designed to carry. She's serious. She actually thinks, but Margaret was already around the corner, coffee in hand, her face composed as still water. Her hands were completely steady. That was the only place the anger lived now, in a single white knuckle where her finger pressed against the foam cup. Pressure, released. Pressure, released. By the time she reached the ICU, her hands were calm again. The medication error happened at 4:17 p.m. Margaret was charting on a post-surgical patient, a 68-year-old male, for hours post-op from a modified aortic valve replacement, when she noticed the order on the screen. Dr. Caldwell had written the anticoagulant protocol himself. The dose was standard, but the patient's renal function had been borderline going into surgery. She scrolled back through the labs. Creatinine at 1.8. eGFR at 38. The man's kidneys were already struggling. The standard dose would accumulate. Not today. Not tomorrow. But by Thursday, the INR could drift into dangerous territory. She found the chart and made the correction, not an override, just a clarification in the dosing based on current renal values. She signed it with her initials, timestamp for 18 p.m., and moved to the next patient. 20 minutes later, Dr. Caldwell found her at the nurse's station. He didn't approach politely. He leaned close, his presence like a physical force crowding her space. His voice was low, meant for her alone, but there was an edge to it that suggested he wanted nearby staff to hear. If you ever countermand my orders again, I will have security escort you from this building in handcuffs. Do you understand, Sergeant? There it was. Sergeant. Not her rank. Not her name. A title meant to diminish, to mock, to remind her that her military experience was something to be pitied rather than respected. His face was beginning to mottle red at the cheekbones, the color of a man unaccustomed to being questioned by anyone. Margaret met his eyes for exactly 1 second, long enough to hold his gaze, not long enough to be confrontational, and nodded once. "Understood, Doctor." He waited, as if expecting her to apologize or explain or break in some small way. When she didn't, he turned and walked away, his movements sharp with frustration. That's when she knew she'd won that particular exchange. The silence after his departure felt like a small victory, though victories in hostile territory were often the costliest of all. But the real cost came 5 minutes later, alone in the supply closet. Margaret stood surrounded by boxes of gauze and fur tubing, the space barely larger than a coffin, fluorescent light casting everything in institutional white. She gripped the edge of a metal shelf with both hands until her knuckles went white, the skin stretching tight across tendons and old scars, the cartography of 2 decades marked in tissue. Her fingers trembled, though not from fear. The trembling was restraint. Pure, concentrated restraint, the kind that came from holding everything inside for so long that the pressure had to find somewhere to go. She reached into her scrub pocket and pulled out the challenge coin. It was old now, tarnished to a dull silver gray, the edges worn smooth from 20 years of being pressed into a small boy's palm in the rubble of a collapsed building in Marja. The same boy who'd had dust in his eyes and fear in his voice and absolutely no idea that the American soldier carrying him out of the destruction had just become the person she would measure the rest of her life against. Margaret stared at the coin for a long moment. The metal was cool against her skin. She pressed it against her forehead, just for a second, and then back into her pocket. No one here knew who she was. No one here knew what she'd sacrificed or why she'd accepted a night shift in Portland instead of the Admiral's office in the Pentagon. They didn't know about the 17 years of classified operations or the 3 Purple Hearts locked in a safety deposit box or the blood-soaked decision she'd made in Marja that had shaped every single day since. And none of that mattered. What mattered was that she was here. What mattered was that the man she'd saved all those years ago was apparently still alive, still serving, still carrying something of that day with him. What mattered was that she'd recognized his face in a trauma bay, which meant her mission was still active, still breathing, still demanding everything from her. She left the supply closet exactly 3 minutes later. Thursday morning arrived with rain hammering the parking lot like distant artillery, and Margaret walked into Cedar Creek Medical at 6:08 a.m., 40 minutes before her shift officially started. She did this most days, came early, checked on overnight patients, reviewed labs, made sure nothing critical had been missed during the night shift. It was routine. It was professional. It was also how she stayed invisible, how she stayed useful, how she made sure no one could accuse her of not knowing the details of every single patient on her unit. The ICU conference room was already filling up by 8:02 a.m. 12 residents in their short white coats lined the perimeter, tablets in hand. For attending physicians stood in clustered pairs near the windows. The nursing director, Patricia Chen, sat at the far end of the room, her expression carefully neutral. Dr. Caldwell stood at the head of the table, his silver hair perfectly styled, his manner carrying the absolute certainty of a man who'd never had his authority questioned and seen it as a character strength rather than a dangerous blind spot. Margaret stood at the medication cart on the periphery of the room, reviewing patient charts on the wall-mounted screen. She was here in her official capacity, night shift nurse reporting to day shift, staying for grand rounds to hand off complex patients. She wasn't at the center of the room. She wasn't even meant to be noticed. That changed when Caldwell pulled up a patient chart on the projected screen. "Gentlemen, let's discuss post-operative management," he announced, his voice carrying the theatrical projection of a man performing for an audience. "This is our aortic valve replacement from yesterday. Nurse Walsh flagged my anticoagulant protocol and adjusted the dosing based on renal function." He said it with the careful enunciation of someone describing a mistake. "Tell us, Margaret, does your military routine from the 1990s override current cardiac surgery standards?" 12 pairs of resident eyes shifted toward her. For attending physicians paused their conversations. Patricia's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like annoyed insects. Margaret closed the chart on the wall-mounted system and turned to face the room, her expression level as a horizon line. The patient's creatinine is 1.8, she said quietly. eGFR 38. Standard dosing would accumulate. Standard dosing, Caldwell repeated, as if tasting something bitter. He smiled, the kind of smile that didn't involve any warmth. Florence Nightingale here thinks she's smarter than our pharmacology team. Tell me, Sergeant Clipboard, did they teach you drug metabolism in whatever field hospital trained you? Behind their tablets, residents smirked. One of them actually bit his lip to suppress a laugh. The nickname, Sergeant Clipboard, was designed to land specifically where it was aimed, at the intersection of her military background and her role as a nurse, reducing both to something quaint and obsolete. Margaret didn't blink. She didn't shift her weight. She didn't feel the need to defend herself to people who'd already decided she was something to be mocked. The pharmacology hasn't changed, doctor, she said. The patient's renal function has. Caldwell's face began its familiar mottle. He turned to the room as if seeking validation from his audience. This is why we maintain hierarchies, gentlemen. This is why protocols exist. Not everyone has the clinical judgment to understand them. He dismissed her with a gesture and moved on to the next patient, but the damage was done, not to Margaret, who'd already catalogued his escalation pattern and filed it away like operational intelligence, but to the entire room's perception of her. She was no longer the quiet night nurse. She was now the problem. She was the one who questioned doctors. She was the one whose military background made her dangerous. The grand rounds continued for another 43 minutes. Margaret stood at the medication cart, present but peripheral, watching the social machinery of the hospital reorganize itself around her newfound status as an outsider. When Patricia Chen caught her eye across the room, there was an apology there, the look of someone caught between loyalty to her staff and the need to maintain peace with the surgeons who brought in the money. Margaret nodded slightly. She understood hierarchies. She'd lived by them for 26 years. Understanding them didn't mean accepting them, but it did mean knowing how to move through them like a ghost. By 9:15 a.m., the isolation was complete. The residents who'd previously nodded at her in passing now averted their eyes. The attendings who'd asked for her opinions on night shift observations no longer made eye contact. Even the nursing assistant seemed to sense the shift, keeping a careful distance as if proximity to Margaret might mark them as unreliable as well. She was exactly where she needed to be, invisible again, cut off from the social networks of the hospital, positioned outside the trust circles that would have made it harder for her to do what she'd been sent to Portland to do. She didn't realize it yet, but Dr. Caldwell had just made the first strategic mistake of his life. He'd pushed her far enough that no one would notice what happened next. He'd isolated her so effectively that when everything fell apart, no one would be able to say they'd seen it coming. By humiliating her publicly, by marking her as an outsider, by reducing her to a punchline in front of 12 witnesses, he'd created the exact conditions that would allow a Master Chief Petty Officer to operate without institutional friction. Margaret pulled the challenge coin from her pocket and pressed it between her palms just for a moment. Outside, the rain hammered the Portland streets. Inside Cedar Creek Medical, the machinery of power and status reorganized itself around the careful fiction that hierarchy mattered more than competence. It didn't. Not really. Not when the person at the bottom was someone who'd spent 26 years learning how to succeed in the darkest places on Earth. The ambulance sirens cut through the Portland night at 11:19 p.m. like a knife through silk. 2 short bursts, then a long wail that echoed off the hospital's east wing. Margaret heard it from the break room, heard it the way a mother hears a baby's cry from 3 rooms away. Her hands moved before her brain caught up, muscle memory operating on its own timeline. She was already standing. Already moving toward Trauma Bay 3 before dispatch finished the call over the intercom. Bullet wounds. That's what they said. Gunshot victim, male, mid-30s, responsive but critical. 3 entry points. The paramedics had given him 2 units of O-negative blood in the ambulance. His pressure was holding at 90/58. Not good. Not yet catastrophic. But the arithmetic of hemorrhage was simple and unforgiving. Blood loss at this rate meant maybe 8 minutes before he went into irreversible shock. Margaret's fingers worked the trauma bay setup with the precision of someone who'd done this exact choreography 1,000 times. Anesthesia cart. Defibrillator pads on the monitor. 2 16-gauge angiocaths already in the cradle. Blood warmer set to 104 degrees. Level 1 rapid infuser waiting like a second heartbeat. The room hummed with contained urgency, the kind of silence that exists only in moments when everything hangs in the balance. Her scrubs were still damp from the last trauma, from the car accident at 10:15 p.m., but she didn't bother changing. Blood was blood. Time was the only resource that mattered. The paramedics burst through the sliding doors at 11:49 p.m., moving in that controlled rush that only comes from experience. Margaret didn't look at their faces. She looked at the stretcher. At the body on it, pale as old porcelain under the fluorescent lights. At the chest heaving in short, shallow breaths. And then the world tilted sideways. His face was older. Sharper. The child was buried somewhere under 2.5 decades of military service and combat and the kind of things that change a person at the cellular level. But the eyes were the same. That particular shade of hazel with the slight upturn at the corners. The small scar on his left cheekbone, thin as a thread, exactly where it had been when he was 6 years old and bleeding in the dust of Marja. Name's Marcus, one of the paramedics was saying. Marcus Webb. Found him 3 blocks from the warehouse district. 3 gunshots, 1 entry at the left shoulder, 1 at the anterior chest below the clavicle, 1 at the lower abdomen. We controlled bleeding with direct pressure, started 2-4 lines, pushed 2 units. He lost consciousness around Burnside and came back around at 4th Avenue. Margaret's hands continued their work while her mind performed a different kind of calculus. Recognition. Confirmation. The weight of 20 years collapsing into a single moment. This man. This SEAL. This soldier. She'd held him as a child in a room with no electricity and a window made of sandbags. She'd pressed a challenge coin into his small hand, a coin that had been pressed into her own hand by someone who didn't come home from that same deployment. She'd made him a promise in a language she shouldn't have spoken to a child she officially never met. Patient's name, she asked, and her voice was steady. It always was. That was the training. That was the discipline. Marcus Webb, the paramedic repeated. Said his military. Didn't give anything else. Stayed conscious long enough to say get him to Cedar Creek. Wouldn't go to Oregon Health. Cedar Creek. Of course. He'd known. Somehow, in the space between bullets and ambulances, between shock and blood loss, he'd made a choice about where he wanted to die or live. And he'd chosen this place. This hospital. Dr. Caldwell was already in the bay, his surgical scrubs already glowing white under the lights, his hands already moving with the arrogant certainty of someone who'd never been wrong in his entire career. Get him to OR 3. I'm taking this one myself. Margaret, prep him for emergency thoracotomy. Type and cross 6 units. Trauma lab panel, CBC, chemistry panel, lactate. Move. It wasn't a request. It was the kind of command that left no room for questions, no space for human judgment. Margaret had heard this voice 100 times, the voice of absolute authority, the voice that said I know exactly what to do and I don't need anyone else's input. The voice that had frozen her in grand rounds, that had threatened to have her escorted from the building, that had made her spend 3 years maintaining the perfect mask of someone who didn't know any better than to take orders from a man who couldn't see her at all. She didn't waste time following him to the operating room. Instead, she moved to the supply closet and changed into a fresh set of scrubs, her movements economical and fast. The old scrubs came off. The blood came off. A new mask. Fresh gloves. And then she did something she'd told herself she would never do, something that would shatter 3 years of careful work and classified protocols and the specific reason she was even in Portland. She walked to the observation gallery above operating room 3. The glass was old, slightly warped, slightly yellow with age. Through it, she watched them wheel Marcus Webb into the room on the stretcher. Watched the anesthesiologist move into position. Watched Caldwell stand over the patient's open abdomen like he was standing over a puzzle he'd already solved 100 times before. The surgeon's hands were steady. His movements were economical. He had the kind of confidence that comes from never having made a mistake, or at least never having witnessed the consequences of one. The surgical team worked in near silence. Just the steady beep of the heart monitor. The soft hiss of the ventilator. The snap of gloves, the clink of instruments hitting the stainless steel tray. Caldwell's voice came through the speaker system, calm, measured, the voice of someone who absolutely belonged exactly where he was. Scalpel. Margaret watched him work. Watched his hands move through the familiar anatomy of the human body like he was reading a map he'd memorized. The chest incision, careful and precise. The dissection through muscle and fascia. The careful exposure of the internal structures that kept a man alive. 15 minutes in, and Marcus Webb's bleeding was controlled. His vitals were holding. The danger had passed into the manageable zone, or so it appeared. And then Caldwell's scalpel nicked something it shouldn't have. The subclavian artery doesn't give warnings. It doesn't whisper. It just bleeds. And when it bleeds the way a fire extinguisher discharges, sudden, complete, with an almost cheerful indifference to whether you live or die. Blood flooded the chest cavity. Not a trickle. Not something measured. A flood. A tsunami of red that covered the surgical field in approximately 2 seconds. Caldwell froze. His hand stopped moving. His jaw tightened. For 1 entire second, maybe 2, he stood there with his gloved hands hovering over the opening, staring at the blood like it was a betrayal. Like the human body had just broken its contract with him. Suction, he said. His voice was different now. Thinner. Get me. The surgical team looked at each other. The resident hesitated. The scrub nurse reached for instruments, then stopped, uncertain. Blood continued to pool. The monitor showed the patient's blood pressure dropping. Not dramatically, but visibly. 70/40. 68/38. Falling toward numbers that meant irreversible shock. Falling toward death. Margaret was moving before conscious thought caught up with her. She was moving before she remembered what the cost would be. Before she remembered that being in this operating room meant the end of 3 years of cover work, the destruction of a classified intelligence mission, the shattering of a careful architecture built to keep her exactly where the Pentagon needed her to be. She was moving because Marcus Webb's heart rate was climbing toward 150 and his pressure was approaching 60/30, and because some things mattered more than any mission. The OR doors swung open. She didn't have a mask on. She didn't have a gown on. She was the most contaminated thing in a completely sterile environment. Every protocol, every rule, every bit of training in surgical safety screamed against what she was doing. She didn't care. Doctor, step back. Caldwell didn't move. He was still standing there, hands hovering, mind somewhere else entirely. Margaret didn't wait for obedience. She grabbed him by the shoulder, firmly, not gently, and physically displaced him away from the operating table. He stumbled backward, his shoulder hitting the wall with an audible thud. Margaret moved into his space. Into his position. Into the blood. Her hands went into the open chest cavity. The sensation was ancient muscle memory, something deeper than thought. The warmth of exposed tissue. The specific texture of the ventricle. The awful, intimate knowledge of what it meant to hold another person's life quite literally in your hands. Her fingers found the heart. She began direct cardiac massage, her hands compressing the organ manually, pushing blood where the damaged artery couldn't. Clamp. Now, she said. Her voice was no longer deferential. It was command. Pure authority. The voice of someone who had spent 26 years learning how to speak in moments when everything was falling apart. Suction left field. I need you to cross-clamp the subclavian, just proximal to the injury. Move. The surgical team moved. Not because she was senior. Not because they'd ever heard her speak like this before. But because in trauma, the voice that knows what to do is the voice that gets followed. The resident stepped forward. The scrub nurse handed instruments. Margaret talked them through the repair while her hands continued their manual compression, her fingers squeezing the seal's heart in a rhythm as old as humanity itself. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, release. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, release. For minutes. Her hands. His heart. The blood pressure climbing slowly. 65/35. 72/42. 80/50. Getting there. Not safe yet, but getting there. Cross-clamps in position, the resident said. His voice was shaking. Hold it steady, Margaret said. Suction. I need to see the artery. The surgical field cleared. Margaret could see it now, the nick, small and catastrophic. The tiny breach in the artery wall that had nearly killed him. She guided the resident through the repair. Primary closure. Small vascular clamp. Careful work. Deliberate work. 10 seconds. 20. 30. The bleeding stopped. Margaret stepped back. Her hands came out of the open chest cavity, dripping blood onto the floor. She looked at Dr. Caldwell once, a cold, flat stare that lasted maybe half a second, and then she turned and walked out of the operating room without a word. In the scrub room, alone, her hands finally shook as she washed the blood away. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass. Margaret sat in her car in the parking garage, 40 minutes now, engine cold, forehead pressed against the steering wheel. The challenge coin clenched so tight in her fist that the raised anchor insignia left an imprint on her palm, small crescents of pressure that would fade but felt permanent right now. She stared at the mark like it was evidence of something. Her phone showed 6 missed calls. Virginia area code. Her handler. The mission was blown. 20 years of Navy special warfare, 3 years embedded at Cedar Creek under a false nursing credential, monitoring suspected fraud in military medical contractor networks, all of it, gone. She'd made the choice the moment Caldwell's hands froze over that open chest cavity. The moment she recognized Marcus Webb's face under the trauma lights. The moment she understood that some promises matter more than operations. Some people are worth losing everything for. Upstairs, Dr. Caldwell was already moving. He'd left the operating room at 3:22 a.m. with blood on his cuffs and fury in his jaw. By 4:15, he was in his office making calls. Board Chairman Whitmore answered on the second ring. Caldwell had referred him to the country club 3 years ago, and Whitmore had never forgotten the favor. I need this documented, Caldwell said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, all restrained power and cold certainty. Unauthorized assumption of surgical duties. Gross insubordination. I want it on record before she tries to spin this. 20 minutes later, Caldwell filed a formal complaint with the Oregon State Board of Nursing. He used the phrase gross insubordination twice. He cited reckless endangerment of patient safety. He quoted Harvard Medical School protocols that she'd violated. He attached her personnel file, which he'd been building for 3 years, every time she'd questioned a post-operative order, every medication correction, every moment she'd made him look less than infallible. By 5 a.m., Caldwell had arranged an emergency meeting with hospital administration. He brought in an outside investigator, a retired surgeon from Harvard named Dr. Pierce, someone Caldwell had met at a medical conference in 2019. I want an independent review, Caldwell told Administrator Chen over the phone. This nurse took over an active surgical procedure. She contaminated the sterile field. She put my patient at risk. The lie was elegant. It had the architecture of truth built around it. Margaret's phone buzzed at 6:23 a.m. An email from Human Resources marked urgent. Terminated effective immediately. Security badge deactivated. Personal belongings to be collected under supervision. The email was professional. Clinical. No mention of Caldwell's name. Just policy violations and liability concerns and the careful language of institutional protection. She read it twice. Then she started her car and drove home. By 9 a.m., 2 security guards appeared at her locker on the ICU floor. They carried a cardboard box. They didn't make eye contact. The day shift staff had already heard, whispers trailing her like a smell, eyes that wouldn't quite focus when she passed. Someone had left a note in the break room, nurses who think their doctors are a danger to everyone. Margaret packed methodically. 1 locker. 3 years of night shifts and correct diagnoses and lives saved quietly while Caldwell took credit. She removed her stethoscope first, the one her father had given her 26 years ago, the day she'd commissioned. She wrapped it carefully in her sweater. Then the photos. Then the shift change reports she'd kept because they documented every time her clinical notes had proven accurate. Dr. Caldwell watched from his office window. Arms crossed. Satisfied. The kind of satisfaction that comes from having eliminated a threat, neutralized an obstacle, protected the hierarchy that kept him at the top. Margaret handed over her badge at 9:19 a.m. The nursing director, Susan Chen, was there. Susan who'd brought her coffee twice. Susan who knew Margaret had saved at least 4 patients from medication errors. Susan would not meet her eyes. "I'm sorry," Susan whispered. Margaret said nothing. The slight clench of her jaw was all she permitted herself, the only visible sign that something inside her had tightened, had prepared itself for something worse than loss. She picked up the cardboard box. It weighed almost nothing. The lobby was busy, morning admissions, day shift arrivals, the hospital in motion without her. Margaret walked through it carrying that box like she was empty, like the box contained her and not the other way around. The volunteer at the desk waved goodbye without really looking. Nobody else noticed. The hospital was already moving on. She made it to the parking garage. Made it to her car. Made it to her driveway in northeast Portland, where the rain had started again, hammering the roof like applause for a performance nobody wanted to see. Margaret sat in her kitchen with discharge papers spread across the table. The challenge coin sat beside them, the imprint on her palm already fading, the evidence of grip already disappearing. She picked it up again. Pressed it harder this time. Tried to make it stay. Her phone rang at 10:23 a.m. Daniel. Her son's voice fracturing with urgency. "Mom, I'm at the hospital, you need to." She hung up. Defeated. Finished. The conversation she couldn't have right now, couldn't handle while everything was still burning. What she didn't know was that Daniel had already made a decision. What she didn't know was that someone at Cedar Creek had tipped off the Pentagon. Someone had called a number that didn't appear in any directory and said, "Master Chief Petty Officer Walsh just got fired for saving a SEAL's life, and the hospital is covering it up." What she didn't know was that 12 miles away, at a federal building in downtown Portland, a 2-star admiral was reading a declassified file and moving faster than administrative protocol was designed to handle. What she didn't know was that her 17-year-old son had retrieved the shadow box from the guest bedroom closet, the one she thought she'd hidden well enough, and was walking through the Cedar Creek Medical lobby with her Master Chief insignia in his hands. What she didn't know was that everything was about to change. But the storm was coming. She could feel it, the way you feel atmospheric pressure before lightning strikes. The rain kept hammering. The challenge coin kept its shape in her hand. And somewhere, very soon, someone was going to understand exactly what they'd lost when they fired a quiet nurse with nothing left to protect. Wednesday morning, 10:23 a.m. The lobby of Cedar Creek Medical was about to become a courtroom. Daniel Walsh stood in the center of the marble floor, 17 years old with his mother's steady hands, cradling a shadow box like it was made of spun glass. Inside, a Master Chief Petty Officer insignia caught the fluorescent light. 3 purple hearts arranged in descending rows. A silver star. His voice carried across the lobby, sharp and clear, cutting through the ambient hum of the front desk phones and the squeaking of orderly carts down the corridor. "Mom, they need to see these." The glass doors slid open. 2 Pentagon officials entered first, men in dress uniforms with the kind of bearing that made hospital security straighten their spines. Behind them, Admiral James Brennan, 2 stars on his shoulders, moved through the lobby like a man who had spent 30 years walking into rooms and changing them permanently. His presence didn't ask permission. It occupied space the way a warship occupies water. The elevator doors on the 3rd floor opened at that exact moment. Margaret stepped out of the ICU, holding a medication chart, wearing the same grey scrub she'd worn yesterday and the day before. The same scrub she wore when she was fired. The same scrub she'd put on this morning because there was no other way forward except through the work. She didn't know what was happening downstairs. She was checking on post-op vitals, the kind of invisible labor that had been the only truth she'd known for 3 years. The hospital intercom crackled. Code green. Lobby. All department heads. She froze. Code green was an internal alert for administrative incident. Not a medical emergency. Something institutional. She clipped the chart back to the rack and moved toward the stairs instead of the elevator. Movement without panic. The composure of someone who had been trained to notice threats the way other people noticed weather. The stairs opened onto the lobby in sections. Margaret saw Daniel first, her son, holding a shadow box the size of a textbook, and behind him the ripple in the room's pressure, the way conversation stopped mid-sentence. Then she saw the uniforms. Then she saw Admiral Brennan's face turning toward the stairwell, tracking movement the way a combat veteran does, the way you track things that matter. Time didn't slow down. Time never slows down. It just becomes very clear. Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, Brennan said, and his voice was the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "You're standing right there." The lobby had maybe 60 people in it. Hospital staff. Board members. Local news cameras that had arrived 20 minutes earlier for what the hospital had told them was a story about community healthcare. They had no idea they were about to witness a federal intelligence operation being declassified in real time. The SEAL was upstairs in the ICU recovery room, sitting up now, his chest wrapped in surgical tape over the sutures where Margaret had put her hands. His name was Jason Chen. He'd been 6 years old when a building collapsed in Marja, when the dust came down like God had turned the air solid, and a woman with quiet hands and scarred knuckles had reached into the rubble and pulled him out, pressed a tarnished coin into his palm, and whispered promises that echoed for 20 years. He'd survived that building. He'd survived 3 combat deployments. He'd survived 3 bullets. And he'd recognized her face in the trauma bay before she even checked his pupils. His medical team wheeled him down from the 3rd floor on a recovery gurney, orderlies moving with the kind of precision that meant someone important had given very specific instructions. The elevator doors opened and 6 Navy SEALs in hospital casual, gym shorts and t-shirts that didn't hide the armored core underneath, walked out in formation. One of them was carrying a classified personnel file that had been hand-delivered by courier at 8 a.m., unopened except by the Admiral's own hands. The SEAL's eyes found Dr. Caldwell first. Found him standing near the administration hallway, trying to calculate an exit strategy. The SEAL's voice was rough from anesthesia and 3 weeks of healing. "That's Wolfhound. She pulled me out of a building collapse in Marja when I was 6 years old. When I was bleeding and screaming and she could have walked past. She didn't. Wolfhound." The call sign Margaret hadn't heard spoken aloud in 20 years. The call sign from the classified mission file, from the deep cover operation, from the 3 combat deployments that were supposed to stay buried in the redacted sections of the federal records. The veteran security guard, he'd been working at Cedar Creek for 18 years, he'd worked at Fort Lewis before that. He understood rank and service and what it meant when a quiet woman showed up 3 years ago and never asked for anything except a place to work. He came forward. His posture straightened. His voice was the formal kind, the kind you only heard at military funerals and medal ceremonies. Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. Naval Special Warfare Command. 26 years of service. Saluting. His hand came up to his forehead. 13 other hospital staff who'd served, who'd understood without being told, saluted too. A nurse. An orderly. 2 maintenance staff. A respiratory therapist. The unspoken network of military people inside civilian spaces, finally visible, finally acknowledged. Admiral Brennan opened the classified file. His voice was steady and public, loud enough for the news cameras, loud enough for the board members, loud enough for everyone to hear what Margaret had been and what she was still. Master Chief Walsh was embedded under deep cover in this facility as part of an ongoing intelligence operation targeting fraud in the surgical department. 3 combat deployments. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. Then Navy SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. Then Joint Special Operations Command Task Force 147. She was wounded twice. He paused, and his eyes found the bandaging on Margaret's shoulder, visible at the neck of her scrubs, the wound from yesterday's emergency surgery where a scalpel had nicked her during the direct cardiac massage when she'd had to reach across her own body to maintain compression. 3 times counting this week. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts from combat operations. 1 Purple Heart from this facility's chief of surgery. The silence lasted 10 full seconds. Exactly 10. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical song. The rain outside hammered against the lobby glass like it was trying to get in. Then Admiral Brennan turned to face Dr. Caldwell. And the room went so quiet you could hear the hydraulic hiss of the automatic doors opening and closing. Dr. Richard Caldwell. You terminated a Navy SEAL team operator while she was actively engaged in an active intelligence mission. You filed false complaints. You activated a network of institutional allies to ensure her termination would be permanent and public. You interfered with federal personnel operating under direct command authority. Caldwell's mouth opened. Caldwell's face went from white to red like someone had turned a dial inside his skull. Admiral, Your consulting contract with the Department of Defense Military Medical Network is terminated effective immediately. Your security clearance is revoked. You're under federal investigation for obstruction of an ongoing classified operation. Brennan nodded to a JAG officer who stepped forward with paperwork. You'll be remanded to civilian authorities pending charges. Security moved in. Not rough. Professional. But final. The kind of final that happens when an admiral has spoken. Caldwell looked around at the people he'd built his authority over, at Dr. Patel, who suddenly seemed to remember every moment in the vending machine. At the nursing director, who was holding his personnel file and his own email authorization for the termination, written in his own hand, time-stamped at 4:48 p.m. the day Margaret had saved a man's life. At the board chairman, who was already on his phone, probably calling his lawyer. At the SEALs team, 6 men whose presence alone was enough to tell everyone in this room that someone important had just been protected by someone they'd underestimated. Caldwell was escorted out the same lobby doors Margaret had been escorted out of yesterday. But this time, cameras followed every step. This time, the local news anchor was already composing her story about a Harvard-trained surgeon who'd been dismantled by a quiet nurse nobody knew how to see. 6 months later. Margaret adjusted her restored credentials on the wall of the ICU, the shadow box Daniel had carried, now hung with honor beside her nursing license. Master Chief insignia. Purple Hearts. Silver Star. The MacGuffin, the tarnished challenge coin, was back in the display case, but its real story was hanging on this wall. The real story was visible. She moved through the morning rounds with the same quiet efficiency, but nurses greeted her by name now, residents asked her advice before they acted, and the patients noticed something different about their care, not softer, but more present. More aware. The kind of attentiveness that comes from having already seen death and chosen to save someone anyway. Through the window of the recovery room, she could see the SEAL or Jason Chen, fully conscious now, wheels turning on his chair as his physical therapist ran him through range of motion exercises. The hospital badge on his shirt said visiting patient, military liaison. He was here for final rehabilitation checkups, but mostly he was here waiting for one moment. The moment Margaret would have her break. Across the street, visible from the third-floor window, Dr. Richard Caldwell was setting up CPR training mannequins in the parking lot of Portland Community College. $14 an hour. His Harvard credentials hadn't protected him from the federal investigators. They'd found what Margaret had been quietly documenting for 3 years: falsified surgical outcomes, inflated success rates, complaints he'd systematically buried by intimidating junior staff. The same fraud Margaret had been sent in to prove. The coin was waiting. Margaret pulled it from her pocket during her lunch break, that same tarnished piece of metal, the one she'd given to a 6-year-old boy in Marja, the one he'd kept on his person through 3 tours, the one he'd had in his belongings when he arrived at Cedar Creek with 3 bullet wounds. She walked into the recovery room. Jason Chen looked up from his exercises. "You kept your promise," he said. "You told a 6-year-old kid that heroes don't leave people behind. Then you left anyway. But you came back." Margaret held out her hand. She pressed the coin into his palm. Her hands were steady. Her voice was quiet, the way it always was. "You hold on to this now. You've earned it twice." He closed his fingers around it. The metal caught the light one more time, reflecting something that looked like the future, looked like mission complete, looked like the weight of 20 years finally set down. Daniel appeared in the doorway with 2 coffees, 17 and proud, no longer asking why his mom worked nights or why she never talked about her job. He set 1 coffee on the bedside table and stood beside his mother, Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, the quiet nurse who'd been the most dangerous person in this hospital the entire time. She adjusted her credentials one more time and returned to her rounds, no longer hidden, finally home. Her next patient was waiting. Her work was waiting. The work was always waiting, and the work was the only truth that mattered. She moved through the ICU like she owned it, not because she was in charge, but because she'd already paid the price for everything here, and everyone knew it. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever kept a secret that cost you everything, if you've ever wondered what it takes to be truly seen, subscribe now. Like this video. Comment below, what would you have done if you were Margaret? What would you have risked? And if you know someone whose quiet strength deserves to be seen, share this with them. Because the people who change the world are rarely the loudest ones in the room.